Stop me if you've heard it before, but Mike Duggan is the $3 bill of Michigan politics, or was anyway. He announced today, Thursday, May 21st, that Mike Duggan is going to be dropping out of the Michigan governor's race. The guy didn't even turn in his signatures before dropping out. What have we learned for this thing? I've been talking about Mike Duggan on the speaking trail across Michigan for months. And by the way, James David Dixon here, host of the James Dixon podcast. As always, we're here for a good time, not a long time. If you support what I do, feel free to give me a review. Feel free to share this out because you're going to want to hear what I have to say next. So, for months, I've been talking about Mike Duggan on the campaign trail. And for months, I've shared with my fellow Republicans that this was the scenario that worried me. Not Mike Duggan leaving, but Mike Duggan staying, and Jocelyn Benson, the Democrat, staying a bad candidate. And enough Democrats saying, okay, Jocelyn Benson is a weirdo. She's a very annoying woman. Her mannerisms are concerning, to say the least. We're going to flee Jocelyn Benson. And thank God we have another choice to go with. We can just go with Mike Duggan. He's still a Democrat. He would tell you himself. And what would concern me in that scenario is if those defecting Democrats were joined by enough Tigers game Republicans to swing this thing for an independent. You know the guy who parks 2 blocks away from Comerica Park, walks to the stadium. That walk is safe. No one's asking for money to watch your car or to wash your car. You walk there with your wife, it's safe. You get a drink afterwards. You get back, your car's still there on all 4 tires, and you think Detroit must be back, and Mike Duggan must have brought it back single-handedly, right? And maybe he'll do something like that for the state of Michigan. And I've always pushed back on the Tigers game Republicans. What I have found to be consistently true, whenever I would talk to a Duggan curious Republican or someone whose friends were Duggan curious Republicans, is that the case for Mike Duggan was always built on what the person didn't know. It was always a castle built of sand and a case built on ignorance. Just this week, I had a Facebook friend tell me, well, man, Detroit never had these kind of teen takeovers when Mike Duggan was mayor. First of all, that tells me you don't know a damn thing about Detroit. There's been no time in the last 40 years since I've been alive. I was born in 1984, the height of Devil's Night, okay? That's the year when you see footage from Devil's Night, it's from 1984. I was born then. And Detroit had problems with teen delinquency, teen problems, teen crime back then. They didn't close down the riverfront parks during the Detroit fireworks for most of Mike Duggan's tenure because the streets were so safe, because everybody was doing so well. No, these problems existed before Mike Duggan. Duggan didn't fix them, and they exist after Mike Duggan. And even if you thought Mike Duggan had fixed Detroit, that it could unravel that quickly after he leaves tells you it was never on a solid foundation. It was always a mirage. And so I have told you guys for months that Mike Duggan is the $3 bill of Michigan politics. Let's just look at the fact that he tried to run as an independent. When someone says I'm running as an independent, you, the average person sitting at home, think that that means I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. I hold some other belief system, libertarian, Green Party, Natural Earth Party, whatever, natural law. I hold some type of legitimate belief system that puts me outside those two. Mike Duggan never said that because it was never true. You go on any of his social media pages, he would be the first to tell you, I didn't leave the Democrat Party because my values changed, which means he was still a Democrat, right? And so if his values didn't change, what did change? His electoral strategy. I wrote for The Enjoyer a story about why Mike Duggan would have felt the need to run as an independent, and that's because the Michigan Democrat Party is a party of girl bosses. Fun fact, Michigan Democrats have not elected a white male as governor since 1986. 40 years ago. That was Jim Blanchard going for his second term. Since 1990, when Blanchard went for a third term and failed against John Engler, whenever Democrats have run a white male candidate, they've lost. Since 2002, whenever Democrats in Michigan have run a white female candidate for governor, they've won. And so rather than fight the winds of history and the natural inclination of Democrats to support an obviously defective candidate like Jocelyn Benson, rather than do that, rather than beat him, rather than join him, Mike Duggan said, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home. I'm going straight to election day. I'm going to be an independent, and I'm the only guy, as of the day I declare, who I know is going to make the November 2026 ballot. It sounded good, but it was too clever by half. Just recently, Mike Duggan was putting out videos saying how much of a travesty it was that he needed 30,000 signatures to qualify for the governor's ballot. And the other, the Democrats and Republicans, they only needed 15,000 each. The problem is that was a lie. That was a lie. There was a Supreme Court ruling, a Michigan Supreme Court ruling that found independent candidates only needed to collect 12,000 signatures. So, and they also have more time to do it. So the Democrats and Republicans had to turn theirs in April, and they needed 15,000. Mike Duggan had until July to turn in 12,000. And given this set of facts that was easily researchable in about 3 minutes of Googling, Mike Duggan tried to turn an obvious advantage for himself into a disadvantage, into proof that the system was unfair. And this should have been one of your first clues that there was problems in the house of Duggan. Okay, politics is about just win, baby. It's not about citing the rule book as an excuse for why you lost. So that told me Mike Duggan was probably having trouble collecting signatures. That he's withdrawn without ever dropping signatures off confirms this theory. But let's hear what Mike Duggan himself has to say about why he has left the stage of politics. I am so disappointed to write this letter, Mike Duggan says on his Instagram. For the last 18 months, I've worked every day to try to change Michigan's toxic party politics. Oh, it's so toxic. And Mike Duggan, the man who cannot open his mouth without attacking Democrats and Republicans both, was going to be the solution. A man who never tried to raise a movement around him where there would be independent candidates up and down the line, up and down the ballot. This guy was going to change Lansing? No, Mike Duggan was always in it for himself. That's why he didn't try to raise up a party, because Mike Duggan doesn't care about anybody but himself. Duggan says he's been supported by hundreds of thousands of volunteers who believe deeply that years of constant Democrat-Republican conflict in Lansing have led to our schools declining, our housing costs rising, and young people moving out of Michigan in record numbers. And the mayor of Detroit was going to fix all this, right? So he says he knew the independent route was filled with challenges. No, what you thought is that you would be hailed as a savior like you were when you ran for mayor of Detroit in 2013. What you didn't realize is that the average Michigander is not as inclined to view Mike Duggan as a savior figure as the average Detroiter was. I'm surprised you don't get this, Mike. You come from Livonia. You know there is a Detroit-Livonia psychology where Livonia is one of the most stable suburbs in the inner ring, and Detroit is our biggest, blackest city, one of the blackest cities in America. Livonia, one of the whitest, Detroit, one of the blackest. And so the idea that a successful white guy who lives in Livonia, a guy who is a CEO making $1 million a year, the idea that that guy would deign to come run the black city, Detroit, that was enough to break a 40-year trend of black mayors in Detroit that started with Coleman Young and ended in 2014 when Mike Duggan took office. And so in the 2013 mayoral race, Mike Duggan did not have his paperwork together. Big shock. Big shock, right? Seems to be a hallmark of Mike Duggan's tenure in politics. In one of the most illiterate cities in America, Mike Duggan ran a write-in campaign. Duggan didn't just score enough to advance to the general election in 2013. He won the primary as a write-in, and he won over a certified bona fide local Detroit legend, super cop Benny Napoleon, who has since passed on. So eager were the people of Detroit for white leadership from a guy from Livonia. So tickled were they at the idea that such a man would support them, would be willing to rule them, that they overlooked the obvious character flaws and consistency flaws in Mike Duggan's paperwork troubles, and they made him king. And king he stayed for 12 years. In this 12 years, we're told some story of a miraculous Detroit rebirth, reboom. It was the comeback city. None of that happened. Yes, Detroit, downtown Detroit's nice, but that has a lot more to do with Dan Gilbert, the town father of Detroit, than the elected mayor of Detroit, obviously. Duggan says he held 5 to 10 town halls a week, and hey, he did show up. I will credit him with that. When I put out the Dixon Declaration, I always say if you can get 10 Republicans in a room anywhere in Michigan, especially in the lower peninsula though, but if you can get 10 Republicans in a room, I will come talk to you. Why do I only need 10? The same reason Duggan only needed 10. Because each of those 10 people represents 10 more people. If you're the kind of person who goes to political events, you're the kind of person whose friends call them and ask, hey, what about ranked choice voting? What about national popular vote? Or what about this guy, Mike Duggan, the Democrat mayor of Detroit, who now says he's an independent? But by April, Duggan says, the mood of the country had shifted suddenly and dramatically. Democrats and independents were unified in anger at Trump's war in Iran. Dragged on, and gas prices rose above $5 a gallon. Duggan says he fought twice as hard against the Democrat headwinds, but internal polling showed that this is going to be a good cycle for the Democrats. The Detroit Chamber of Commerce, which was pro-Duggan, had endorsed Duggan just last week. They put out a poll showing Duggan running dead last against Democrats and Republicans, against John James, against Jocelyn Benson, against any combination that was polled. And so Duggan said it wasn't the polls that bothered him, it was the inability to raise funds. Governors' campaigns, Duggan writes, are today overwhelmingly funded by well-established networks of national party money. And so he's been trying to build an independent network. Well, Mike, if you're supposed to be the guru of politics, you can't tell me it's a surprise that it was going to be harder to raise money and gain traction as an independent when there is no independent party, when there is no infrastructure behind you, and when you're going to take attacks from Democrats and Republicans alike. If you were going to do this, if you were serious about doing this, you would have raised up a movement. Instead, you tried to elevate a man, and that man was yourself, and we all saw how selfish you are and how little regard you had for anyone beyond yourself. Duggan, you sat up here and you campaigned for months. You pretended that you had the answers for 1 million public school children in Michigan. But when you were mayor of Detroit, the poorest city in Michigan, one of the poorest in America, for 12 years, you never took any interest in the school system. You never pulled in the leaders of Detroit, Cade Cunningham, Trick, whoever, Charlie LaDuff. You never pulled in all these guys and said, hey, I need your help. I was raised by a strong father, and for my kids, I was a strong father, but I can't help but notice in the Black community in Detroit, a lot of our children are on their own. A lot of our women are on their own. You knew about Detroit's problems, but you only saw those as a means to an end, as a means to more power for yourself. If you cared about the people of Detroit, you would have cared about the family structure in Detroit. But you didn't, so you didn't. And so he said, Duggan says, finally, we've concluded that the national fundraising for these independent groups is too much in infancy to be of great help to our race in 2026. Knock me over with a feather. It's hard to raise money when you're not affiliated to one of the two big parties in America. Who could have ever predicted this? I mean, I keep hearing about how Mike Duggan is this great politician, wrote the book on politics, but I never met that guy. I wrote a story for History of Michigan Politics. I'll link it in the show notes about how in 1987, the year after his father is appointed to a federal judgeship by Ronald Reagan, which to this day, 40 years later, is still used as proof that Duggan has some kind of latent conservatism, republicanism in him. Uh, Duggan ran his mother's mayoral campaign in Detroit, Joan Duggan. And Joan Duggan ran in a, essentially a 3-person primary at the top spots. She came in the winner, but the third guy dropped out and endorsed the second guy. And in the general election, the second guy won and Joan Duggan lost. And Mike Duggan was there holding the bag. Mike Duggan had to go to the loser's locker room that night. This guy couldn't get his mom across the goal line of a city that his mentor, Ed McNamara, had run, and in a city where he, Mike Duggan, had run wild for many years, and his mom was a known figure. Didn't anticipate that the third candidate would drop out. Didn't anticipate that that third candidate would have a sizable voting block that would need to be courted. Let someone else do that, and that man who got that support, Jack Kirksey, a building in Livonia bears his name to this day. That could have been the Joan Duggan building, but it wasn't because she lost using Mike Duggan's strategy. And I think to 2013, Mike Duggan, the guru of politics, the guru of good government, couldn't get his paperwork right. Then in December 24, a month after the Democrats lose the 2024 election, Mike Duggan never had urged Democrats to moderate themselves, to move to the middle, nothing like that, but he leaves anyway. Not because he's not a Democrat, he still was, but as an electoral strategy. Duggan knew that Democrats were likely to support a woman, that woman being Jocelyn Benson, in the governor's race. Rather than fight hard and compete, Mike Duggan left. He became an independent, and he hoped to siphon off enough Republican money and enough Republican votes to make things work. And so I've spent months going around Michigan talking to Republican groups and disabusing them of the notion that Mike Duggan is a guy you'd ever want in a position of power in Michigan. The first question I always ask, do you want your town to be more like Detroit or less like Detroit? And anywhere you live in Michigan, I live in Southfield, okay? I'm 2 miles north of Detroit as I'm speaking. And that answer would be no, anywhere you go in Michigan. People in Pontiac don't want it. People in Inkster don't want it. Nobody wants their thing to be more like Detroit. So what the hell would we be electing the former mayor of Detroit to do to Michigan? My friend Chris Long just made a great video over the weekend about Mike Duggan. The theme of it is, don't Detroit my Michigan. That were the rest of Michigan to be given the Detroit magic that you can expect from Mike Duggan, Michigan would be a much worse place. Check it out.
We've turned Detroit around. Just imagine what I'll do for the whole state as governor. This place could use some Detroit magic. Perfect. This is just like home in Detroit. This glockenspiel needs the spirit of Detroit too. Even the Grand Hotel here on Mackinac Island needs my touch. There we go. This is what Michigan looks like under my leadership, just like Detroit. Hey, Grand Rapids, watch this. Even our universities need fixing. The Michigan Learning Center. Hey, Holland, you're going to need some Detroit spirit. Damn, looks like we don't need to do anything to these roads after all. Thanks, Whitmer. I'm Mike Duggan, and I'm the Democrat in disguise. Don't let Democrat Duggan Detroit our Michigan. This is an AI-generated political advertisement. This ad is not paid for by any candidate or candidate committee. It is not authorized by Mike Duggan. This ad was created by Chris Long.
The second question I would always ask people about Mike Duggan is, if he were still a Democrat, if he were running for the Democrat Party, would you support him? And they always say no, of course not. And then I would ask, well, what makes you think he isn't? And right then the light bulb would click. And just to emphasize that, I would take it a step further and I would say, if Mike Duggan wore a blonde wig and called himself Michelle, would you then believe that he's a woman? Of course you wouldn't, because his 67 years of life tells you that he's a man. People are what they are, and they are what their track records say. Self identification is incredibly unhelpful in getting to the truth of who a man is and what he believes and what he would do with power. You're much better off looking at that person's past and Mike Duggan's past, present, even the way he carried himself on a day to day basis. Just look at that UAW debate the other night. This was the last time you'll ever see Mike Duggan in a political stage. Mike Duggan basically told stories about how, as mayor of Detroit, he would bend over backwards when the union said jump. Mike Duggan said how high. He didn't just use his bully pulpit at mayor to support unions during labor unrest. He would actually call the companies and kind of try to twist arms so the union got the best possible deal. And I think what really killed it for Duggan is when he said that he would veto right to work if the Michigan House and Michigan Senate were to pass such a bill. That's what a Democrat would say. That's what a Democrat would do, which makes sense because Mike Duggan was and is and always will be a Democrat. And so my whole problem with his independent run is, if a man is willing to lie to you about what he is, what is he being honest about? Mike Duggan would lie about anything. He lied about how many signatures it would take an independent candidate to make the ballot. When you have less signatures required and you can't gather those, and you blame the rules you should have known before you ever signed on as a candidate, that shows you to be a clown and not a serious man. Now that Duggan's gone, I hear from Republicans worried that, oh my God, we needed Duggan. We needed Duggan to make the math work. That's not how I see it. That's not how I see it at all. Because without a Mike Duggan, who at least gives some appearance in some warped sense where people believe, even without any evidence, that he's a business guy that they could work with, without him, where does the Tigers game Republican go? They come back home. They come back home where they are needed, where they are appreciated. This is the end of illusion. All you're going to be left with is a far leftist woman who basically her only voting base is wine moms and the soft men who love them, versus a Republican who is not a communist. I don't think that's a very tough choice to make. If you find it a tough choice to make, guess we're going to have a tough year, because you guys must like losing. If you find it in any way difficult to decipher between Jocelyn Benson and any Republican who would win the primary, then you want to lose. It's just that simple. This is an easy one, and it's actually easier without Duggan around. But I will say Duggan leaving does change the race a bit. Going into the primary, my metric for who I would support was always this: who is best suited to take on two Democrats at once, Mike Duggan and Jocelyn Benson? With Duggan gone, the question now becomes, who matches up against a woman who's won twice statewide, a woman who wrote a whole book about being the hero of your own story. And I think the way you take on Jocelyn Benson is by presenting as a public servant who's here for you, who's here for the voters and the people of Michigan, while Jocelyn Benson's campaign slogan might as well be, I'm with her. It's a vanity campaign. It's a girl boss campaign. It is easily toxic and easily rejected by the average Michigander. We've seen this game before with Gretchen Whitmer, except Whitmer at least has some native charm to draw on. Jocelyn Benson is lacking in human qualities whatsoever. So I don't see this as being a tougher thing with Mike Duggan gone. I see it as bringing the clarity that Republicans need, that there is no safe cigarette, that there is no sane Democrat, that there is no middle of the road Democrat who you could kind of work with on some things. There's no safe Democrat. The Democrat Party is unsafe at any speed, and Jocelyn Benson is a much better representation of that than Mike Duggan was, even though their records weren't all that different. So we sit here at the end of the campaign that couldn't, that never was, that was never going to work. And I have to ask you, What have we learned? So I have to ask at the end of it, at the end of the day, at the end of the Duggan, what have we learned? You Duggan curious Republicans out there, what have we learned from watching Mike Duggan's candidacy blow up in exactly the kind of ways you could have predicted? Mike Duggan was never an independent. He was a Democrat with an electoral strategy who was too lazy to figure out the rules before he ran, who was too selfish to build a movement around him. And now, at age 67, he is gone from Michigan politics forever. And my question for you is, what have we learned?